Atomic alert. More than a quarter of a century after the Cold War ended, the threat of a nuclear strike is back. We'll ask how prepared we really are to deal with a world leader who might press the launch button. I'm Dana Lewis, and this is Insight. Welcome to Insight. 4 minutes. That's not long. A bit longer than your average pop song. But that's how long you would have had to prepare for a nuclear attack if you were living in Britain during the Cold War. Now, it's more than a quarter of a century since people lived knowing that at any minute the sirens could sound, that the unthinkable was really happening. But now we have a new generation of world leaders who once again may be prepared to use the ultimate weapon. So how prepared are we for the reality? Before we look at today's situation, I've been to a place that acts as a living reminder of nuclear Armageddon. People and governments have spent decades thinking about the unthinkable, nuclear war, and how to survive it. And to give you some idea of how they spent tens of millions of dollars to survive, we've brought you to what was a secret nuclear bunker, the Kelvedon Hatch bunker, 30 miles outside of London. Let's go inside. You're inside a nuclear bunker. This is a 120-meter long tunnel which takes you under 2,000 acres of farmers' fields. It goes and goes underground 3 stories to protect people from a nuclear war. At the end of the tunnel, big nuclear blast doors in the event of a nuclear attack, and hundreds of people would then lock themselves inside. Mike Parrish is the curator now of the bunker. Mike, good to see you.
How do you do?
They really were preparing for nuclear war.
Absolutely. This is the plotting floor. This is where they'd have plotted where the air bursts and the ground bursts would have been and the radiation was spreading, so that they could then mobilize troops to move the population away from the radiation.
Who would be allowed in here?
There'd have been a cabinet minister. He would have been the man in charge, the commissioner. He'd have been supported by his principal officer, who'd been an ordinary minister or senior civil servant.
Prime Minister?
Prime Minister would possibly have come here. This is the London bunker, and this is one of the ones he might well have arrived at. And of course, the whole job was to allocate surviving resources to those of us that had survived.
Sundays, holidays, vacation time, we must be ready every day, all the time, to do the right thing if the atomic bomb explodes. Duck and cover. This family knows what to do.
Imagine a country paralyzed by nuclear war. How does a government function or communicate? Through hardline communications, and this was it in the bunker. In the event of a nuclear attack, the air would become unbreathable. Radiation so intense outside, in this bunker they had air filters to clean the air and generators for power. Some nuclear experts say the risk today of nuclear war is higher than it was 20 years ago.
I think we are more in danger of the use of nuclear weapons than at some points in the Cold War. I think it's important not to exaggerate. There are times, we now know, looking back in history and looking at the documents and interviews, there have been times when we have been really close to the use of nuclear weapons. Cuban Missile Crisis, everybody knows about that. There are doctrines that imply the possible first use of nuclear weapons. And we're not just talking about President Trump getting up in the middle of a crisis and going, right, I'm going to threaten nuclear weapons and it's all going to go that way. Even a country that is perceived as responsible, like the United Kingdom, has a policy of using nuclear weapons first.
Experts have considered what would happen if there was a bomb blast in Manhattan.
If you had a 20-kiloton weapon detonated in the middle of, let's say, 1,000 feet above Central Park, that's an air burst, that causes more damage than a ground burst. You would have everything in 14 blocks in every direction would be basically burning. And the smoke and poisonous gases that come from glass and steel and plastic burning would cause radiation probably to another 10 miles and toxic chemicals, not unlike the 9/11 attacks that you saw, the smoke and the toxic air that went all over that part of Manhattan, particularly the firemen and policemen who went into the building had terrible respiratory problems. And so you would have basically immediately somewhere around 200,000 casualties, which would be dead and wounded, and then you'd have another probably 1.2 million people that would get radiation poisoning and sickness. Some would die, some would get sick.
Scenario: India and Pakistan go to war and fire 50 nuclear weapons at each other.
And at the time we did this study, each side, India and Pakistan, had about 50 of these weapons. Today, they likely have at least twice as much. It's more similar to what happened in Hamburg and Dresden and Tokyo, as well as Hiroshima during World War II, in which firestorms were ignited. These fires build up for hours after the explosions, and the heat builds up, and they create their own weather, sucking air in as the air rises, feeding the fires, and turning the entire cities into charred smoke. Nuclear winter is what would happen in such a large war. And nuclear winter is a term that was first used in the 1980s when studies were done of the aftermath of a war between the United States and the Soviet Union.
In planning for nuclear war, they had to contemplate tens of thousands, maybe millions, exposed to radiation and dying.
One of the reasons we have this open as a tourist attraction is because the children of today are our prime ministers of tomorrow. And you're quite right, one does need to make sure that those in power are realistically appraised of what the consequences would be.
This nuclear bunker is now a museum, but it's a sobering tour of what nuclear war could mean to our world. I'm joined by Paul Ingram, who is the Executive Director of the British American Security Information Council that aims to have a world free from the threat of nuclear weapons. And with us also is former senior officer in the Royal Air Force, Afzal Ashraf, who is a national security specialist. I mean, first of all, just coming out of that item and visiting that bunker, it's very sobering when you think about this in terms of what can happen in the world. Do you think our leaders today are as sober as they were 20, 30 years ago? Afzal?
I don't think so, because 20, 30 years ago I was in the armed forces. We were practicing on a monthly basis for a nuclear scenario that we knew we were going to control. NATO was going to be the first to use nuclear weapons. We knew how we were going to escalate from tactical to intercontinental nuclear weapons. So we had a scenario that we were in control of. What has changed now is that unlike the previous situation where NATO was conventionally weaker than the Soviets, so was forced to use nuclear burst, Russia and other countries are now weaker conventionally, and the only option they have of defeating the West is to use nuclear first. Now, I'm not aware of that scenario being exercised, thought through by academics, by the military, by Ministry of Defense, and actually thought of in terms of response. And I think that is one of the weaknesses we have. It's particularly in the political leadership who really don't understand modern warfare.
Paul, are we closer?
Well, we just heard about the political leadership. I think the political leadership in this country and in other countries uses nuclear weapons for completely different purposes than the deterrence that we're told about. I mean, if you look at this country, nuclear weapons are used in the domestic political scene to demonstrate resolve, to demonstrate a willingness to go places that other people would not be willing to go to, or the alternative, a sort of purism, a sort of I'm whiter than white, I'm not going to touch these things, I would never launch a nuclear weapon. These are positions, political positions, that play nicely to core votes, but they don't actually address the real issues at stake, which is how do we move from a world which is based upon the threat of such massive annihilation to one that escapes this danger.
If there is an exchange, we're talking about a nuclear winter. I mean, these weapons can doom our world. And the yields from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the yields of nuclear weapons today are much, much greater.
Mm. Well, they're much greater, but on the other hand, there's a greater variety. So, for example, if we look at the tactical nuclear weapons currently in Europe, and the new ones that will be shipped over from the US when they're finished in development, the B6112, they are dialable, so they can go down to 0.3.
You can dial a yield.
You can dial a yield, and that means that it is possible to have a massive explosion, far bigger than Hiroshima and Nagasaki, from the same bomb, or a smaller one. And the smaller one, more targeted, becomes more usable, and that's where it starts to shift from being the threat of massive, overwhelming retaliation towards the possibility that people might think we can fight a nuclear war.
And so would you comment on how close we've come? Because when I started reading back in the scenarios, okay, we all know about the Cuban Missile Crisis. November 9th, 1979, 4 command centers in the U.S. nuclear arsenal received data on their radar screens that there is a first strike the Soviet Union is launching. June 30th, 1980, NORAD detects 220 missiles inbound. They call back to National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski, and they say, sorry, we were mistaken. It's 2,200 missiles inbound, and he is recommending to President Carter they launch a nuclear strike. And the phone rings again and says, sorry, it was a mistake. September 26, 1983, there was another one, and when the Russians didn't fire, they had satellite communication. I mean, people don't realize how close we've come to the brink.
We have, and in addition to the many instances, and those are mostly technical issues, we've had, before even the Soviets developed nuclear weapons, I think it was General May, one of the top generals in the US Air Force, advocating first use of nuclear weapons before the Soviets could develop them, and luckily he was dissuaded, or he wasn't listened to. We've had the Liberty Affair in the 1960s, which was an attack by the Israelis on an American ship under the guise that it was from the Egyptians, and there was, at least for a few minutes, a response that could have led to a nuclear war, which was, again, luckily stopped. I mean, so we have come to close on many occasions.
Indeed, and I think that what occurs to me when I read through it, and maybe to you too, is that we've gone more high-tech with computers.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, one of the changes, one of the massive shifts in today's world is the problem of cyber attack, and that is an added complexity to the dangers that we were talking about. I mean, we just seen the attack of WannaCry that brought 200,000 or 300,000 computers to a stop. Now, there is always exposure. There is always the possibility of cyber attack, and I've just about to publish a report with a Russian hacker demonstrating the vulnerabilities of every nuclear weapon system.
If we're not worried enough already, Paul, you have more.
Exactly.
Well, I think that the cyber threat and what Paul mentioned earlier about adjusting the yield to provide a degree of precision are all in some ways very misleading developments, in that they can give decision makers a feeling of security and control that they actually don't have. The point is, if it's a nuclear weapon going off in your backyards, unfortunately, the only response that is available for anybody who possesses nuclear weapons is an all-out strike, because they know they can't be sure that they will have an opportunity to escalate. So if they're going to survive, they will go for an all-out strike. So
is that rehearsed? Because a lot of people don't get that. I mean, somebody fires 2 missiles at you. Do you respond with 2? Do you respond with 5? Do you go for an all-out response? And there really has not, that decision making is not rehearsed, and it's extremely unpredictable.
Absolutely, and this is where the rehearsals that we used to have in the Cold War era, they're not really talked about very much in public. We had a sacrificial landmass called Europe. And that was where the tactical nuclear weapon exchange was going to take place, and if that didn't halt things, then we were going to go intercontinental. The problem is, in the modern scenario, we don't have that sacrificial land, and so any suspicion, and you've cited examples from the US, where there is a suspicion that we're about to be attacked, the response is, let's launch as soon as possible, because we may not get the chance to do so later.
The incident you referred to in 1983, when Stanislav Petrov made the decision not to let his superiors know in the Soviet Union, He saw on his screens 5 American missiles coming towards the Soviet Union. He judged that is not credible. There is no scenario where the Americans would launch a small number. They would either launch everything or none at all, and that's why he didn't respond.
When we come back, I want to talk to you about what happened after President Obama's pledge to rid the world of nuclear weapons. This is Insight. We'll continue our conversation after this short break.